Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on European history, and I have earlier spoken to you about the rise of absolutism in Europe, and we presently are discussing the phenomena of rise of absolutism in England. And I have earlier spoken to you about this particular theme, rise of absolutism in England. I have covered already not only the backdrop, the political and economic backdrop against which absolutist monarchy emerged in England in the form of Tudor monarchs, but I have also spoken to you about the legislature and the executive wing of governance, which was gradually strengthened by Henry VII, who was the first Tudor monarch from 1485 onwards, well into the 16th century, and he had made several efforts to very imaginatively use some of the institutions that existed in English history to good effect so far as consolidating his political power is concerned, so far as getting better of the older feudal lords are concerned. When I say older feudal lords, think of the traditional big landholders who were exercising a lot of political clout in the earlier times, because Henry VII had shifted the social base of his absolutist monarchy from the older aristocracy to the new aristocracy, and new aristocracy is nothing but the gentry, the middling feudal lords or the lower feudal lords who did not have huge chunks of land, but they were the ones who had invested into the upcoming commercial and economic efflorescence of Europe in 16th century, who were not loath to change, who were not loath to changing the tenurial rights in their land, and they were the ones who were actually engaged in putting out system, in enclosure movement and so forth, and also trading activity, the bourgeoisie, the middle class and so forth. So they constituted the new social base over which the monarchs in England actually rested, and that section provided some kind of a political tacit support to the upcoming monarchy, and we shall proceed from here because I have spoken to you earlier about how Parliament was made use of by Henry VII, how taxation structure was tweaked by Henry VII to favor the upcoming bourgeoisie and the lower gentry. They were not taxed harshly, whereas the older aristocracy were their powers were very much cut into, and this is how the story goes so far as consolidation of absolutist monarchy in England is concerned. And as you can see on your slide, we have Statute of Livery. Now, Statute of Livery is nothing but a mechanism by which maintenance of feudal lords was carried out, and the feudal lords were to be restricted from keeping army. And this is another way in which the Tudor monarch is, keeping the clout of the older aristocracy in check. And then we have the Star Chamber. Now, this represents, since I have earlier spoken to you about the legislative and executive side of governance, therefore we are talking now about the judicial side of it, how judicial component of governance was made use of by the Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VII, to further enhance his power or to strengthen royal clout and power. is through the Star Chamber, and this is a judicial institution instituted in 1487, and again it also drew most of its people from the new class, that is the gentry, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and this institution was very instrumental in furthering the cause of the absolutist monarchy in England, and it almost struck a sense of terror among people, particularly the big families. So there is an institution, judicial institution, that's there to strike a sense of fear among those who didn't quite comply with the absolutist royal commands. Then we have another institution in the form of court of request. Now, this was instituted during Henry VIII, not 7th, and as you can see on your slide, the timeline is given 1509 to 47. Now, this again was an arrangement to weaken the powers of the feudal lords. In the earlier interaction, I had told you that the main challenge for any absolutist monarch was to see that church's power is restricted, and that was for that the monarch did not have much to do, because Reformation movement had begun in 16th century, and the English church got nationalized. It became Anglican church, dissociated from the affairs of the pan-European Christendom and so forth. So that issue was taken care of in a movement of Reformation itself, whereas the other challenge that was there for any absolutist monarch, and that was the circumventing of power of the feudal lords. So feudal lords' powers were significantly weakened through different ways and means, and court of request instituted during Henry VIII period is one such institution. I have earlier spoken to you about a Star Chamber and so forth. The taxation structure, I am coming back to it because this is very important. The taxation structure also had provisions for forced loans, wardships, taking the management away from the deceased feudal lords whose sons were below the age of 18. So if a feudal lord died before his son could attain adulthood or could attain the age of 18, then the management of his his area became the responsibility of the state, and this was a mechanism by which the monarchical power asserted itself. Similarly, several lords had to give loans to the monarch in case of requirement, and they had compulsory wardships that they had to perform. All these things significantly circumvented the traditional ways through which these feudal lords had been exercising their political clout and power over their area. And yet another mechanism, of course, was acceptance of knighthood. So it's like conferring knighthood, but at the same time ensuring compliance. And anyone who was knighted, any feudal lord who was knighted, it became very clear that he has complied, and the possibilities or the threat of revolting against the monarch was significantly minimized. So all these mechanisms were designed to weaken feudal lords, and this was absolutely necessary for any upcoming political monarchy to assert itself. Then we have benevolence, and benevolence is just the name of a voluntary tax to begin with that was paid by the rich trading community to the state. And this you can see that to begin with it is voluntary. That means that this new social base which was supporting this absolutist monarchy in its infancy was not taxed, and this tax is not coercive. To begin with, it is voluntary. And of course, as I have told you in my earlier interaction, that this particular arrangement was not a very good tight taxation arrangement. You could not have continued with this kind of arrangement where you don't tax the most the most prosperous of the communities of the merchants, the traders, or the gentry and so forth, or being soft on them. So you could not have continued with this arrangement for long, but to begin with, this is what the Tudor monarchs resorted to, and the problems associated with this kind of a structure of taxation became evident only towards the end of the Tudor rule, in the reign of Elizabeth, who was the last Tudor ruler, or subsequently when the Stuarts started ruling. So that's when these problems became very evident, but it went well so far as the initial part of Tudor rule is concerned, and we will talk about what other circumstances actually allowed it to function reasonably fine for a century or so. Now, one important thing that we should all remember is that Tudor political power actually rested on the extraordinary powers and institutions, or you can say extraordinary measures, expedient measures that were instituted by Tudor monarchs. So it is to begin with, it is by the exercise of those expedient measures that it consolidated its powers, and this particular slide just lists some of these institutions like Council of Wales, Board of High Commissioners. As you can see, this was instituted to deal with religious offences, particularly during the period of Elizabeth, and all these expedient measures which were justified only on account of the emerging extraordinary situation of a particular period, but that was very effectively exercised. In fact, English executive was well oiled, and it is through the exercise of or strengthening or deepening of the executive power that English monarchy actually made itself more powerful and absolutist. This is in contrast to France, and we shall see that further. Now, these prerogative powers, as I said earlier, were the base of Tudor power, and by 1641, once these prerogative powers were questioned, particularly by the Parliament, then these powers had to be dissolved, and the Parliament actually came to do away with these expedient measures. But to begin with, Tudor rulers somehow managed the parliamentary proceedings, and they continued with these prerogative powers or expedient measures, and that is how they could create political clout and capital out of it. So the English monarchy, as I was saying, was strong from the executive point of view. In fact, legislature, as was evident in the last slide, that when things became evident, then Parliament could come to exercise some legislative limit on the executive exercise of power, and this is something that did not happen in France. In the case of France, I have spoken to you earlier about the case of absolutism in France, and there you don't find these legislative constraints being encountered by the absolutist monarchs of France like Louis XIV and so forth. In fact, they also had institutions like Etats Generaux, etc., but their meetings were hardly convened, and it was allowed to lie dormant for several centuries, right? So that is the kind of difference that you get to see with respect to the experience of absolutism in England and in France. So if you look at it from comparative point of view, we get to know that it were the legislative limits placed on the executive powers of the monarch that reduced its powers in England, and this was quite unlike France. Now, in England, this is yet another you can say feature of English absolutist monarchy, there was a parallel growth of absolutist power of the monarch and also the feudal powers. In fact, the parliament was constituted of barons, bishops, knights and townsmen. So, by the time we reach 17th century, it's not as if the power yearnings of the feudal lords were only crushed and were not given any you can say articulation. In fact, the institution of parliament was where these feudal lords could enter and articulate their views or exercise power, and that is how some kind of a balance was struck. That is how it did not allow the build up of some kind of a revolutionary situation in England, and again this was quite unlike France, where you had something of the sort of the French Revolution happening, where there was a general burst of angst and energy at a one point of time in a very sudden cataclysmic way. Now, that is something that was avoided in Britain, because there are institutions which could absorb the angst, the yearnings, the power aspirations through different institutions. As I just said, that what the feudal lords, mid-feudal lords were losing with respect to the absolutist monarchy in terms of exercise of power, that lost power was somehow articulated in another way through the mechanism and instrument of parliament, through the institution of parliament. And by the time of Edward III, we find that there is some kind of a parallel growth of absolutist power as well as the parliamentary powers, which in fact articulated the feudal powers. English judiciary, therefore, we can very safely say that it developed by the fusion of nobility and monarchy, and this is quite unlike France again, where I have spoken to you earlier about it. The bailies were actually the creation of monarchy and monarchy alone, and there was nothing local about it. There was no organic growth or there was no organic assimilation of past practices into the new phenomena of absolutism. But in England, you find that one component of governance, that is judiciary, is very much assimilating the past practices of officials and folk courts, etc. And there is a distinct survival of pre-feudal judicial authority of folk courts, and this provided some kind of a terrain for this blend to happen, that is with past to blend with the change. So, continuity and change get blended through this institution. So, we have sheriffs who were selected from local gentry and not central bureaucracy. Again, this is a contrast that you can see with respect to France, where these judicial officers were actually the appointees of central bureaucracy. So sheriffs were selected from local gentry. They were appointed by the rulers, all right, but it is the local gentry. So there is that seamless blend that is happening of pre-feudal judicial authority and institutions, and also the manpower. As I have spoken to you earlier, that this was very much unlike France, where the bailies or even Spain, where they were either judicial authorities and officials were either monarchical or feudal. There is no blending that was happening. But in England, there is a blending, and hence it gave English history a more harmonious kind of transformation from tradition to modernity, and there was no sudden break from the past the way it happened in Spain and France, which led to some kind of a rupturous kind of change through French Revolution and so forth. In England, there is a gradualism, in this process of transformation, in this process of development into a powerful base for the Tudor rulers. English nobility had become a professional class of military men, and this was again due to internecine wars, because with the penetration of money economy in 16th century, they had even started having cash contracts with other armies, and Tudor rulers by their legal and judicial methods effectively demilitarized the old feudal barons, and that is how they circumvented their power. And the geopolitical factors of England being an island country, not engaged in warfare, quite unlike other countries in 16th century Europe, which were always at war with each other, that allowed England not to invest much in maintaining army. In any case, its nobility had effectively been demilitarized. That allowed English absolutist governance mechanism and apparatus to operate at a low cost. So the burden of it did not fall on the people. So they were not required to be taxed heavily, right? And therefore no big army was required, in contrast to other countries like Spain, France, or Netherlands, who were always at war, or there was no post there was no post of Holy Roman Empire for which the king was aspiring, and so forth. So it could develop its navy, England could develop its navy for its trade and commercial purpose, and not for military war. It avoided major expenditure in warfare and army, and so absence of army also ensured that people being rather free from excessive tax burden, and therefore there was high purchasing power and living standard that could be maintained by Englishmen, in contrast to other countries. It also gave a distinct character to the English nobility, which were demilitarized, connected with civil life, and depended on trade and commerce, and were very commoners in their outlook. So all these things give us a kind of flavor of English absolutism, and I have discussed the legislative, the executive, the judicial, including the taxation issue, and also spoken to you about the geopolitical distinctness of England, which allowed it to have a kind of absolutist monarchy during the Tudor period the way it was. Thank you.